I'm Helena Vance, 55, and I gave the United States Navy 33 years and came up the hard way to Rear Admiral, though my own father spent every one of those years certain I was nothing more than a clipboard sailor who never really went to sea. For decades, I made myself smaller so he would never have to feel the distance between the daughter he imagined and the one standing in front of him. But when a young ensign ordered me off the pier at my own ship's christening and my father looked away rather than watch it happen, I made a choice that changed everything between us. Have you ever been underestimated by the one person whose belief you wanted most? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. It was a Navy town, the kind where the weather report mattered more than the news, and my father came home from the sea smelling of salt and diesel and certainty. I was 13 years old the first time I understood that there were two navies in his mind and that I would only ever be allowed into one of them. He sat at our kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug the size of a small bucket, and he told the neighborhood boys about a night in the North Atlantic when the sea tried to take his ship and the chiefs would not let it. The boys leaned in. My brother Garrett leaned in. I leaned in hardest of all. I should tell you what that kitchen looked like because I have carried it with me onto every ship I ever served on. There was a calendar from the base exchange on the wall, a chart of local tides taped beside the refrigerator, and a row of his ball caps on hooks by the door, one for every command he had ever loved. The whole house smelled faintly of coffee and machine oil, even when he had been home for a month. When my father told a story, the dishes stopped clattering and my mother stopped moving and the air in the room seemed to lean toward him. He was not a large man, but he took up a room the way the sea takes up a horizon, completely and without trying. When he finished, I said I wanted to do that too. I wanted to go to sea. He laughed, and the laugh was warm, and that was the cruel part, because cruelty would have been easier to put down. The real Navy isn't an office, Helena, he said. It's a wet deck at 2 a.m. and a chief screaming at you to hold the line. That's not a thing for a girl to want. My father, Walter Vance, was a senior chief petty officer, a boatswain's mate, 30 years on the water, and he loved the Navy the way some men love a religion. He could name every ship he ever served on and tell you the weather on the day he reported aboard each one. I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything before or since, for him one day to say my name in the same voice he used for those ships. My brother Garrett was 3 years older, and he understood the rules of the house instinctively in a way I never could. He learned early that the surest way to my father's approval was to laugh at the things my father laughed at, and one of the things my father laughed at gently was the idea of his daughter at sea. So Garrett laughed too. It was not malice. It was survival. In a house with one weather system, you learn which way the wind blows, and you set your sails accordingly. And Garrett had always been the better sailor of the two of us in that one respect. He read the wind and went with it. I spent my whole life tacking into it. My mother, Lorraine, kept a shoebox. I did not learn this until much later. Every time I won something, a swim meet, a science fair, a spelling certificate, she clipped it or folded it and tucked it into that box on the top shelf of the hall closet. She never showed it to anyone. She just kept it, a quiet record of a daughter that the loudest voice in the house was not reading. In the autumn of 1989, I got into the United States Naval Academy. I will not pretend I did it for myself. I did it for a sentence I thought the acceptance might finally unlock. My father drove me to the gate at Annapolis, and he was proud. I could see he was proud, and then I heard him tell another father in the parking lot that his daughter was there for the academic side. Not to be an officer, to study, as if the word officer might not survive being said out loud about me. At Annapolis, I met Sabine Quintero, who became the sister I chose, the one person who looked at my family from the outside and saw it clearly when I could not. We were roommates, then friends, then the kind of friends who can finish a hard truth the other one started. She would matter later. She would matter more than almost anyone. In May of 1993, I was commissioned an ensign, dress whites, white gloves, the whole long ceremony in the sun. My father shook my hand, not the way a father shakes his daughter's hand, but the way one sailor shakes another's when he is being polite to a stranger's kid. "The fleet will sort the romance out of you quick," he said. And then, before the photographs were even finished, he was already half-turned toward the parking lot, ready to go home. There's a photograph from that commissioning day that my mother kept for years. In it, I am standing very straight in my dress, whites with my brand new Ensign bars catching the light. And my father is beside me, and he is looking not at the camera and not at me, but at something off to the side, the parking lot, the road home, the next thing. For a long time, I could not look at that picture. Later, I understood that it was the most honest photograph anyone ever took of us. A daughter facing forward into a life she had chosen, and a father already turned toward the door, unable to see that the life was real because it did not look like his. I told myself the sea would be enough. I told myself I would cross any ocean for that one sentence, and if it took an ocean, then I would swim. I was 22 years old, and I did not yet know how long a person can keep appealing a verdict that was handed down before she ever stood up to speak. I did not know that the wanting would follow me up every gangway and into every wardroom for the next 3 decades, a quiet stowaway I could never quite put ashore. What I knew was the water, so I went to it. It was the only thing I was sure would have me. The 1990s hardened the gap between me and my family into a habit, and habits are harder to break than arguments. I went to sea on small gray ships and did the unglamorous work that actually moves a fleet. Navigation, engineering casualty drills, standing watch in weather that would have impressed even my father if he had ever once asked what my weather was like. He thought a clipboard was the opposite of courage. He had a whole philosophy about it. The clipboard was the desk was the soft navy was not real. He never stood a mid-watch trying to keep a ship off the rocks with nothing but a chart, a clipboard, and 200 people who trusted what was written on it. He never understood that the clipboard he sneered at was the thing that brought those 200 people home. I learned my trade in the parts of the Navy that never make a recruiting poster. I learned to take a ship into a crowded harbor at night when the buoys and the city lights blur into one long smear and the only thing between you and a collision is your own steadiness and the people you have trained. I learned to fight a fire in a space full of smoke, to flood and counter-flood, to keep a wounded ship swimming when everything wanted it to stop. I learned that the loudest part of leadership is almost never the loud part, that mostly it is showing up at 3 a.m. when something has gone wrong and being the calmest voice in the compartment. None of that was visible from a kitchen table 2,000 miles inland. None of it could be. So to my family, I simply did paperwork on a boat that never sank, which to them proved nothing, because in their minds it had never been in any danger to begin with. My brother Garrett took the family verdict and made it into a comedy routine. By the middle of the decade, Garrett was selling boats to weekend sailors, which he found no irony in at all, and at every holiday, he would introduce me to relatives with the same line. "This is Helena, our sailor who's never been seasick. Hard to get queasy at a desk." Everyone laughed. My father chuckled into his drink. My mother changed the subject and refilled the potatoes. I called home in the winter of 1998 to tell my father about my division. I had 30 sailors by then, young and difficult, and mine, and I had gotten them through a brutal underway without losing a single qualification or a single kid. I was proud, and I wanted him to be. He listened for about a minute, then he asked in the gentlest possible voice whether I had thought about getting out and finding a real job near home. Something steady, something a person could see. He was not being cruel. That is the thing I could never explain to anyone who only heard the story secondhand. He simply could not see it. And the not seeing was its own kind of wound, the kind that does not bleed and does not close. Sabine called me that same night, the way she always seemed to know. I told her about my father and the real job near home, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said the thing I have never forgotten. "Stop auditioning," she said. "You are auditioning for a man who already cast you. He gave you the part of disappointment in 1971, and he has never once held a new reading. You are a lieutenant in the United States Navy, Helena. Stop performing for a closed audition." I did not take her advice. Of course, people almost never take the good advice the first time they hear it. They have to walk a few more years down the wrong road first, until the road runs out, and only then do they turn around and find the signpost a friend put up long ago. But I never forgot the word she used, auditioning. It described exactly what I had been doing my whole life without ever having the name for it. Every promotion, every command, every hard tour I volunteered for, Some part of me had been performing all of it, toward one seat in one imaginary theater, where my father sat with his arms crossed, waiting to be impressed and never quite getting there. I hung up and looked out at the gray winter sea, the same sea my father loved, and I decided that the sea would simply have to be enough, because the alternative was to keep waiting for a curtain that was never going up. I did not know, standing there, that the sea was about to ask me for everything. I did not know that in a little over a year I would learn exactly what my father meant by a wet deck at 2 a.m, and that the price of learning it would be a man I could not save. The verdict was in. It had been in for years. I just kept filing the appeal. Now I have to take you forward almost 3 decades to a clear Saturday morning in early June of this year, to a shipyard and a gray destroyer standing high on the ways with the whole world's bunting strung along the rails. The Navy had named its newest destroyer, and the Navy had asked me to be its sponsor. The sponsor is the person who breaks the bottle, the person whose name is tied to the ship for as long as it sails. It is one of the great honors of a naval life, and I had been given it for reasons I had not yet told my family, because I wanted my father to find out the way you find out the tide has turned, by looking up and seeing the water already at your feet. I flew them all out. My father, 80 now and slower, but still square in the shoulders. My mother, who cried at the airport for no reason she would name. My brother Garrett, who had stopped selling boats but never quite stopped the routine. I told them only that I was part of a ceremony, and I dressed the way a sponsor dresses, in a navy formal coat with no insignia on it anywhere, because the sponsor wears civilian clothes. There was nothing on me that morning to tell a stranger I had spent 33 years in the United States Navy. The shipyard that morning was a beautiful kind of chaos. There were hundreds of folding chairs in neat white rows, and a band tuning in the shade of the hull, and yard workers in hard hats lining the upper rails to watch a thing most of them had helped build. The destroyer itself stood high above all of it, gray and enormous and not yet alive, the way a ship is not quite alive until it has a name and a crew. The christening platform sat up near the bow, and on it, in a polished cradle, was the bottle, wrapped in netting and ribbon in the ship's colors, waiting for a hand. I had looked at that bottle from a distance and felt the whole weight of what it meant, and I had thought, with a flutter I had not felt in years, that my father was about to watch his daughter pick it up. I had imagined the morning so many times. In none of my imaginings did it start with me being told to leave. I should have stayed glued to my escort. I know that now. But the lanes near the christening platform were thick with people, and a young aide pulled my mother and the men toward the reserved seats, and at the same moment my own escort got pulled away by a voice on his radio, and just like that I was a woman alone in a coat trying to reach the bow of a ship. I stepped toward the pier access that led up to the christening platform, and a young ensign stepped directly into my path. He was 23, maybe. Fresh, pressed, certain, running crowd control at the rope with the seriousness of a man guarding a vault. Ensign is the most junior commissioned rank there is, the very first rung, and he wore it like it was the whole ladder. "Ma'am, this pier is for the official party only," he said. "I need you to step back behind the rope." "I understand," I said. "I'm expected up at the bow. I'm part of the ceremony." He gave me a small, disbelieving smile. The smile you give a tourist who has wandered somewhere they should not be. "Everyone here is part of the ceremony, ma'am. The official party has badges. Please step back." I told him my name. I told him calmly that the Admiral's staff was expecting me at the christening platform, and he heard exactly none of it, because all he could see was a woman in a coat who would not take a simple no, and he had a pier to keep clear, and he was 23 and certain, which is its own kind of armor. I could have ended it in one sentence. "I want you to know that." I could have leaned in and quietly told him my rank and watched him fold and walked up that pier with him trailing apologies behind me. The words were right there. But I have spent my whole career learning that the moments that test you most are the ones where you have every right to use your power and choose not to. He had not done anything wrong. He had done his job correctly with the only information he had. And the information he did not have was about to arrive on its own, with more authority than I could have summoned. And a thing that arrives on its own teaches a young officer more than a thing you force on him ever will. "I won't ask again," he said, and his voice dropped into the flat tone they teach you for exactly these moments. "This is a secured pier. I need you off it. Now." Here is the part I have never been able to scrub from that morning. My father was 20 feet away, already seated, and he saw the whole thing. He saw his daughter stopped at a rope and told to leave. And he looked down at the program in his hands and studied it, the way you study something to spare yourself the embarrassment of watching. He was not cruel. He was 80 years old, and he believed in that instant that his daughter had once again ended up somewhere she did not belong, being turned away by someone who did. The ensign's order did not cut me. My father's bowed head did. I have stood on the bridge of a warship in a typhoon. I have made decisions that 200 lives depended on and made them in seconds. And I want to tell you honestly that none of it ever made my hands feel the way they felt watching my father find something fascinating about a folded paper program rather than watch his daughter be sent away. The ensign was a stranger doing a job. My father was the audience I had been performing for since I was 13, and in the one moment I had built the entire day around, he chose not to look. There is a particular loneliness in being unseen by the exact person whose seeing is the only thing you ever wanted, and I felt all of it standing behind a velvet rope in a coat with no rank on it. So I did the only dignified thing left to me. I stopped. And I waited, because I knew the way you know the weather is about to change exactly what was coming up that pier. And then a woman in service dress came down the line, saw me standing at the rope, and went absolutely still. Her name was Commander Pier Castellano, and she was about to take the ship to sea as its first commanding officer, and 12 years earlier she had been a junior officer on a destroyer I commanded. She looked at me, standing behind a rope with a 23-year-old ensign blocking my path, and the color left her face. "Ma'am," she said. One word, but she said it the way you say a word when you are bracing to attention and the whole temperature of the moment turned over. The ensign, Forsyth, his name was Caleb Forsyth, I would learn it later and I would make a point never to forget it, looked from the commander to me and back, and you could see the first cold suspicion arrive on his face that he had made a mistake whose size he could not yet measure. I want to slow down here, because what happened next is the part people always get wrong when they imagine a moment like this. They imagine the satisfaction. They imagine the woman drawing herself up and letting the young man have it. That is not what it was. What it was, mostly, was sad and quiet and over very fast. Commander Castellano stepped close to the ensign and told him, lo, who the lady in the coat was. I watched it land. I watched the blood go out of his face the way it had gone out of hers, except hers was recognition, and his was something closer to falling. He started to turn to me. He started to find the words that do not exist for a moment like that. I did not let him reach for them. I touched his sleeve, the way you study a young sailor on a pitching deck, and I said the only thing worth saying. You stopped someone you didn't recognize from walking onto a secured pier, I told him. That is exactly what I would want my ensign to do. Stand easy. He stood easy, or he tried to. His hands were not entirely his own yet. I have thought about why I did that, why my first instinct toward the young man who had just turned me away in front of my father was to protect him rather than to crush him. The honest answer is that I was once him, not literally, not at a christening, but I remembered with perfect clarity what it felt like to be 23 and certain and assigned a job you were determined to do correctly, and to discover in one horrible heartbeat that doing it correctly had put you crosswise to someone you should have recognized. That is one of the most frightening feelings a young officer can have. And I knew that what he did in the next 60 seconds and what was done to him in the next 60 seconds would set something in him for the rest of his career. A leader gets to decide, in moments like that, whether a young person walks away smaller or larger. I have always tried to choose larger. The Navy gave me that lesson a long time ago, on a deck in the worst possible way, and I have never forgotten the price of it. That night in the hotel, Sabine sat across from me with the foil from the christening bottle still tucked in my purse. And she did what she has always done, which is refuse to let me talk about the easy wound instead of the real one. Forget the kid at the rope, she said. He saluted and he learned, and he'll be a better officer for it. I want to hear about the man in seat 4, the one who watched his daughter get turned away from her own ship and decided the most important thing in the world was his program. And I had no clever answer because she had walked straight to the center of it. I had not arranged any of this for the Navy. The Navy already knew who I was. I had flown my father across an entire country and seated him near the bow of that ship for one reason, and one reason only. The same reason I had felt at 13 at a kitchen table. I wanted him to look up and see me. "I have commanded ships," I said. "I have written letters to the families of sailors I could not bring home. I am a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. And I am apparently never ever going to stop wanting that man to look up from his chair and see me." Sabine let that sit. Then she leaned forward. "The day isn't over," she said. "The citation hasn't been read yet. And you get to choose, right now, whether you keep managing his comfort the way you've managed it your whole life, or whether you let the name on that ship do what it is going to do, in front of him, with no softening from you." I thought about it for a long time. I thought about every time I had made myself smaller, so my father would not have to feel the distance between the daughter he imagined and the one he had. The countless visits home where I had not mentioned a promotion until somebody else did. The command tour I described as a busy year. The medal I never once put on the wall. I had spent decades sanding down the edges of my own life so that it would fit comfortably into the small frame my father had built for it, and I had called that being a good daughter, when really it was just the longest audition in the world. "You've been doing his job for him," Sabine said. "His job is to be proud of you. You've been doing it for him for 30 years by hiding the things he might have to be proud of, so he never has to feel bad about missing them. Stop. Let the day be exactly as big as it is." And I decided she was right, and I decided I was done. I was going to let him hear all of it. Every word. The hardest order I have ever given in 33 years of service was the one I gave myself in that hotel room. Stop protecting him from who you are. Let me tell you about the bottle, and the man who put it in my hands, because that is the moment everyone wants, and it deserves to be told properly rather than rushed. While Commander Castellano had been quietly turning the ensign's world over, the crowd near the bow had begun to shift and part, the way a crowd does when something large is moving through it. And what was moving through it was Admiral Stephen Halloran, 4 stars on each shoulder, the presiding officer for the christening, and a man under whom I had served when he commanded a strike group and I commanded one of his ships. He did not look at the ensign. He did not look at the rope. He walked the full length of that pier in the unhurried way that only the most senior people in any room are ever allowed to walk, and he came to the christening platform, and he lifted the beribboned bottle out of its cradle with both hands. And then he turned, and he placed it into my hands. He placed it there the way you hand a person something that was always theirs to begin with, something you have only been keeping safe for them. "Admiral Vance," he said, and he said it loudly enough that the front rows heard every syllable. "We're ready for you at the bow. Whenever you're ready, ma'am." He called me by the rank my father had never once said out loud in 55 years. He said it the way you say a thing you have known and respected for years, with no flourish, no performance, just the plain weight of fact, and somehow the plainness of it made it land harder than any speech could have. Admiral Halloran had buried sailors with me. He had trusted me with his ships. When he said my rank, he was not announcing it to the crowd. He was simply speaking to a colleague he esteemed, and the crowd happened to overhear. And that is the most powerful way a reveal can ever happen, when it is not a reveal to the people who matter at all, only to the ones who never bothered to look. Ensign Forsyth came to attention beside me and brought his hand up in a salute, and his hand was not quite steady, and I returned it cleanly so that anyone watching would understand that the matter between us was closed and that he had done nothing he needed to carry. A salute can forgive a man faster than a sentence ever could. I have thought a great deal since that morning about what it must have been like in seat 4. My father half rose out of his chair. I saw it from the corner of my eye. An 80-year-old man, a senior chief who had spent his life certain he knew exactly what the Navy was and exactly what his daughter was not, hearing a 4-star admiral call her admiral and hand her the bottle for the ship. I watched him try to fit the word into the daughter he had carried in his head since 1971. And I watched the word refuse to fit. Garrett went still beside him, the running joke dying in his throat before it could be born. And my mother was crying and reaching into her bag, and I knew without seeing it that she was reaching for the shoebox. 30 years of clippings she had finally finally earned the right to be right about. I have replayed that 10 seconds more than any other 10 seconds of my life. Not because it was a triumph, though I suppose from the outside it looked like one. I have replayed it because of what it must have cost my father to live it. Imagine being 80 years old and discovering, in front of 1,000 strangers and a 4-star admiral, that the story you have told yourself about your own child for half a century is simply wrong. Imagine every joke you ever made landing back on you at once. There is a kind of person who would have gotten angry in that moment, who would have decided the world was making a fool of him and dug in. My father was not that kind of person, not underneath. Underneath the certainty, he was a sailor, and a sailor knows how to recognize a fact about the sea, even when the fact is bad for him. And the fact standing in front of him now, holding a christening bottle, wearing no rank but called Admiral by an admiral, was his daughter. I walked up onto the christening platform with the bottle in my 2 hands. I passed within a few feet of my family. I met my father's eyes once, only once, and I said nothing at all because there are moments that a speech can only make smaller. I had imagined, in the hotel the night before, all the things I might say to him in that walk if the day went the way it was now going. I had imagined some of them being sharp. I had earned a few sharp ones over 55 years, and a smaller version of me had been saving them up. But when the moment came and his eyes found mine, full of a thing I had never seen in them before, something that was equal parts shock and shame and a dawning, painful pride, every sharp sentence I had saved simply dissolved. I did not need them anymore. You stop needing the speech the moment you no longer need to convince anyone. He could see me now. That was all I had ever been asking for. And it had finally happened, and a person does not waste a thing they waited 55 years for by spending it on a wound. I turned to the bow of the ship. I set my feet. I had practiced the swing, the way every sponsor does, but you never really know until the bottle is in your hand and the ship is above you and your whole life is somehow standing behind you in folding chairs. For the United States and all who sail in her, I said, I christen the United States ship Okafor. There is a tradition among sponsors that you put your whole arm into it, because a bottle that does not break on the first swing is supposed to be bad luck for the ship, and no sponsor wants to be the one who gave a warship a poor start. But I will tell you that in the half second before I swung, I was not thinking about luck or tradition. I was thinking about a man in heavy seas who went back for 2 strangers and did not come home. And I was thinking that this gray steel was going to carry his name across oceans he never got to finish crossing, and I put everything I had into the swing for him. I swung, the bottle struck the bow and burst, and the foam ran down the gray steel, and a sound went up from the crowd that I felt in my chest more than I heard. The ship had a name now. The ship was alive. And somewhere behind me, an old boatswain's mate was on his feet without ever deciding to stand. You are wondering about the name. You should be. Because the name on that bow is the whole reason any of this matters, and it is the reason I had asked the Navy, when they offered, to let me be the one to break the bottle. An hour after the christening, at the reception in a hall overlooking the water, a Navy reader stood and told the gathered guests who the ship was named for, the way it is always done. And I watched my father's face as the words came. Senior Chief Boatswain's Mate Daniel Okafor, lost at sea in March of 1999 in the North Atlantic during the rescue of the crew of a foundering vessel. The rescue had been led, the reader said, by a young officer, then known as Lieutenant Helena Vance, who received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for her actions that night. My father heard the rate. Boatswain's mate, he heard the rank, Senior Chief, his rate, his rank, the exact life he had lived, worn by the man my ship was named for, the man I had lost. I need to take you back to that night, because my father spent 30 years describing it to me without ever once knowing he was describing it. It was March of 1999, and I was 28 years old and a lieutenant, and the sea was doing the thing my father always talked about, the thing that separates the real Navy from the idea of it. A fishing vessel was going down in heavy weather, and we were the ship that answered. I led the rescue and assistance detail. That is the clipboard job. That is the desk Navy. That is the part my family thought I did instead of the real thing. It was a wet deck at 2 in the morning, and there were chiefs screaming to hold the line, and one of them was Daniel Okafor. I can still feel that night in my body, if I let myself. The cold was not like cold on land. It was a living thing that got into the seams of you and started taking pieces. The deck pitched so hard that we rigged lines just across it, and the spray came over the side in sheets that knocked the breath out of you. I was 28, and I was the officer in charge of the detail, and every person on that deck was looking to me to tell them it could be done, and how. That is the job my family never saw. That is the clipboard. The clipboard is a young woman bracing herself against a lifeline, screaming bearings and orders into a wind that wants to throw them back in her teeth, while men she is responsible for go over the side on her say-so. We got most of them. We got them across in seas that had no business letting anyone live. Daniel Okafor was the steadiest hand on that deck, the senior chief who seemed to be in 3 places at once, the man whose calm was so total that it became everyone else's calm. And then there were 2 left on the foundering boat, and the window was closing, and Senior Chief Okafor went back. He looked at me first. That is the part I have never told many people. He looked at me, and I gave the order, and he went, and we both knew the math of it. He went back the way the best of them always go back, without a debate, without a backward look, because going back was simply who he was. He got the last 2 clear. The sea did not let him come back the 3rd time. I wrote the letter to his family myself. I was 28 and my hand shook, and I wrote it anyway, because that was also the job. The part of the job no one puts on a recruiting poster. I wrote it 7 times before I sent it. I still remember the wastebasket full of the versions that were not good enough, because nothing is good enough, because there is no arrangement of words in any language that makes a sentence like that. One lands softly. In the end, I told them the truth, which was that their husband and father had died doing the bravest thing I had ever seen a human being do, and that 2 families were whole that morning because of him, and that I would carry what he did for the rest of my life. I never displayed the medal they gave me. It did not feel like mine. It felt like a thing I was holding for a man who could not hold it. For years afterward, I carried the order I gave that night. People who have never led in a moment like that imagine the guilt would come from giving the order. It does not, or not only. It comes from the fact that you would give it again. Okafor went back because it was right, and I sent him because it was right, and 2 people are alive today, with children and grandchildren, because of a choice that cost the best chief I ever knew his life. You do not get to feel clean about that. You get to feel that you did your duty and that your duty was terrible, and you carry both for the rest of your days, and you write the letter and you go back to sea. So when the Navy commissioned a destroyer and told me it would carry his name and asked whether I would consent to be its sponsor, I did not say yes for the honor. I said yes because it was a promise I had been carrying for 27 years, and this was finally a way to keep it. I wanted his name on something that would outlast me, something with engines and a crew and a flag, so that 100 years from now, a young sailor would ask who Okafor was, and someone would have to tell the story again. My father did not know any of that. He had spent my whole life telling me the real Navy was a wet deck at 2 in the morning and a chief screaming to hold the line, and he had described in perfect detail the worst and most important night of my life, without ever knowing that his daughter had been standing on that deck. I watched the words do their work on him in real time. I watched him hear boatswain's mate and flinch, because that was his rate, the thing he had been, the identity he had worn with such fierce pride for 30 years. I watched him hear senior chief and go pale, because that was his rank, the summit of his own career, the thing he had measured the whole world against. And then I watched the last piece fall, the understanding that the man who held his rate and his rank and gave his life in the exact storm my father always spoke of, had done it under the command of the daughter my father had spent a lifetime calling a clipboard sailor. It was as if every word he had ever said about the real Navy had been a description of a photograph he had never bothered to look at closely enough to notice his own child standing in the center of it. At the reception, he walked up to the citation board and read it. Then he read it again, and he turned and looked at me across that hall as though he were seeing, for the first time, the whole dark ocean standing behind his daughter. He took off his cap. He held it in both hands like a young sailor at a funeral. He could not speak, not yet. But the man who had needed a wet deck to believe in courage was standing on a dry reception floor, finally believing. I want to be honest with you, because the easy version of this story would have my father sweep me into his arms at that citation board and undo 30 years in a single embrace. And that is not what happened, and I am glad it is not, because that version would have been a lie and this one is true. He came to me at the reception, and he started a sentence 3 times before he could finish one. Men built the way my father was built do not have a clean road to an apology. The words are not in their toolbox. So he did not apologize, not in the way you might want him to. He did something that, from him, meant more. He asked me to tell him about Okafor, sailor to sailor. I knew 100 chiefs like him, he said, and his voice was not steady. I served with men exactly like that. I just never once thought my daughter was the officer one of them would follow into the water. Tell me about him. Tell me right. It was the first time in my entire life that my father had ever asked me about the Navy as though I were actually in it. For 55 years, he had spoken to me about the sea as a teacher speaks to someone who will never go there. Now he was speaking to me as one sailor asks another to carry a story right because the story belonged to both of them. The shift was so small and so enormous that I almost could not breathe through it. And I will tell you what I did, because I am not entirely proud of how tempted I was to do the other thing. I was tempted to fall straight into it, to give him the easy, warm forgiveness, to let the good moment paper over the 30 years, because I had wanted his attention so badly for so long that any of it felt like water in a desert. Instead, I held the line. Sabine had taught me that on a winter night in 1998. So I told him about Daniel Okafor, honestly, every true thing about a man who went back when going back was death. And then I told my father the other true thing. You looked at your program this morning, Dad, I said. When that ensign turned me away from the rope, you looked down at your program. And I felt that more than I felt anything that boy said. I have felt that my whole life. I need you to know that before we stand here being a nice family at a nice party. I need you to know what the looking away cost. He took it. To his great credit, at 80 years old, he took it standing up, and he did not look away this time. He held my eyes, and he nodded, slowly, like a man accepting a true report he did not want and could not dispute. Garrett found me near the windows a little later. My brother is not an eloquent man, and he did not try to be. He just said that somewhere along the way the desk sailor joke had stopped being funny, and he had not noticed exactly when. And he was sorry he had kept telling it long after it died. Then he stopped telling it. That was the whole apology, and from Garrett it was enormous, and I took it as it was meant. He stood next to me for a while looking out at the water, and then he said one more thing, quietly, almost to himself. He said that he had spent his whole life going with the wind because it was easier, and that watching me stand at that rope and not bend had made him feel, for the first time, like the one who had taken the soft path. I told him the wind was a hard thing to sail against, and that nobody gets a medal for the family weather. He laughed a little sadly and bumped my shoulder with his, the way he used to when we were kids before the house taught us our parts. And then my mother did the thing she had been waiting 30 years to do. She put the shoebox on the table in front of my father. All of it, every clipping, every certificate, every promotion notice she had saved while the rest of them were busy not watching. She set it down in front of him without a word. I watched my father go through that box one clipping at a time, in order, oldest to newest, the way a man reads a logbook he should have been keeping himself and somehow never did. A swim meet, a science fair, an ensign in dress whites, a lieutenant, a commander, a captain, an admiral, the entire story of a daughter kept by the one person in the house who had been reading all along. He stopped on one of them for a long time, a small newspaper photograph from 1999, a young lieutenant receiving a medal she did not feel she had earned. He had never seen it. He had not known it existed. He touched it with one finger, the way you touch something you are afraid is not real. And when he looked up at me, his eyes were wet, and he said, very quietly, "You never told me." And I said, "You never asked." It was not said to wound him. It was simply the truest thing in the room. He nodded and looked back down at the box, and he kept reading, and my mother put her hand on his shoulder, and for a while none of us said anything at all, because some silences are not empty. Some silences are a family finally hearing itself. Trust does not snap back into place. It is not a rubber band. It is built the way you build everything that lasts, one plank at a time. Fitted and fastened and tested, before you trust your weight to it. That afternoon, in a reception hall over the water, we laid the first plank. Time moved the way it does, and not everything tied itself into a bow, because real life does not do that, and I would not trust this story if it told you otherwise. A few weeks after the christening, a handwritten note arrived at my office. It was from Ensign Forsyth. It was not an apology, or not only that. He wrote that he had thought more about the part where I told him to stand easy than about the part where he had been wrong. He wrote that he had requested a transfer to the surface warfare community and a billet aboard the ship, aboard Okafor. "You told me to stand easy, ma'am," he wrote. "I have thought about that more than the part where I made the mistake. I asked for Okafor. I would be proud to stand a watch on her. I read it twice, and then I put it in my desk drawer, where I keep the few things that remind me why any of this is worth doing." A young man I never reported, never dressed down, never diminished, had taken the worst 30 seconds of his young career and turned them into the reason he wanted to go to sea. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, very close to everything. I wrote him back. I did not say much. I told him that every officer worth following has a story about the day they were certain and wrong, and that the only thing that separates the good ones from the rest is what they decide to do with it afterward. I told him I would be glad to have him aboard Okafor, and that the ship he was joining was named for a man who understood, better than anyone I ever served with, that the whole point of being certain was to be certain about the right things. I sealed it and sent it, and I thought, not for the first time, that the Navy is really just a very long chain of people deciding whether to make the person behind them larger or smaller, link after link, year after year, all the way back to the founding and all the way forward to a future none of us will see. Sabine came through town not long after and told me I seemed lighter, and she was right, and when she asked me why, I had to think about it before I could answer her honestly. It wasn't the rank, I told her. It wasn't the ensign, and it wasn't even my father finally seeing it. It was that I stopped auditioning. You told me to, 28 years ago, on the phone. It just took me until now to actually put the script down. She lifted her glass to that. We had both come a long way from two girls sharing a room at Annapolis, certain the world owed us a fair reading. And my father called me, not for an occasion, not for a birthday or a holiday or a ceremony. He called on an ordinary Tuesday evening to ask how my week had been, which he had perhaps never done in 55 years, and we talked about nothing in particular for 20 minutes, and at the very end, as he was getting off the phone, he said it. "Talk soon, Admiral." He said it plainly, almost shyly, the way a man tries out a word in a language he is just beginning to learn. The sentence I had waited my entire life to hear did not arrive with a band or a flag or a 4-star admiral to announce it. It arrived small and undramatic on a Tuesday, which, I have come to understand, is exactly how the real ones always arrive. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after he hung up. I am not a woman who cries easily. The Navy trains that out of you, or you train it out of yourself, because there are watches to stand and people who need you steady. But I sat in my study with the dial tone in my ear, and I let myself feel the whole strange size of it. 55 years, a lifetime of swinging at a target that kept moving, and here at last it had held still long enough for one quiet word to land. Some people get the grand version, the embrace at the citation board, the speeches. I got a Tuesday and one word, and I would not have traded it for anything, because a Tuesday is a thing you can build a future on. Grand moments end. Tuesdays come back around every week for the rest of your life. That night I sat in my study with the foil from the christening bottle, which I had kept, and a photograph of Daniel Okafor, and the shoebox, which my mother had finally given to me. I read every clipping in it, in order, the way my father had at the reception, and I sat with the question that the whole strange, beautiful day had left in my hands. What do you do with a father you have finally got, and the decades you do not get back? I did not have the answer yet, but for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of the question. The verdict that had been handed down before I could speak had finally, after 55 years, been overturned. And now there was this quiet, open water on the other side of it, and a choice about what to sail toward. I sat at my window a long time that night, an admiral with a foil wrapper and a shoebox, deciding to build something in the space the old verdict had left behind. Months later, the ship was commissioned, brought fully to life and into the fleet, and we all stood pierside again, the same family, in almost the same place. Except that nothing about us was the same. It was a bright, hard day, and the ship looked enormous and ready, and my father wore a small senior chief's pin on his lapel, the rate he had carried his whole life and the rate the ship's namesake had carried into the water. While we waited in the line to board for the ceremony, a stranger ahead of us asked my father, just making conversation, whether he had any connection to the ship. And my father, 80 years old, said, without being asked twice and without being prompted at all, "That's my daughter, the Admiral. She christened this ship." I want you to understand what that sentence was. It was the exact inverse of a man standing in an Annapolis parking lot, telling another father that his daughter was there for the academic side. It had taken 33 years to turn that first sentence into this one. But he said it freely to a stranger in public, with something in his voice I had waited my whole life to hear, and I had to look out at the water for a moment so that no one would see what it did to me. The stranger, who had no idea he had just walked into the middle of a 33-year story, simply smiled and said that must make my father very proud, and my father said, "It does." 2 words. He said it the way you state a fact about the tide. And I realized, standing there in the line, that the thing I had wanted my whole life had never been the salute or the rank or the bottle. It had been those 2 words, said by him, meant by him where I could hear them. Everything else had just been the long way around to getting there. Ensign Forsyth was aboard, on the quarterdeck, standing his watch as his ship was commissioned. We saw each other across the deck. He came to attention, and I gave him a small nod, and he returned it. And a loop that had begun at a rope on a crowded pier closed itself cleanly, with no humiliation in it anywhere. Only 2 officers who had met at a bad moment and chosen to make it a good beginning. And I met them at last, the people the whole day had truly been for. Daniel Okafor's grown children, a son and a daughter, standing under the name of the ship that carried their father's name into the future. They thanked me. They thanked me for the ship and for being the one to break the bottle. And the daughter told me that for years she had only known her father was a hero in the abstract, and that now he had a gray steel ship and a crew and a future, and she could put her hand on the cold plate of it and feel that it was real. That was the deepest payoff of all of it, and it had nothing to do with my family. It was a promise kept to another. The clipboard officer, the desk sailor, the daughter who was supposedly never on the real deck, had carried a dead chief's name for 27 years, and finally set it somewhere it would last longer than any of us. I introduced them to my father. I thought it was important. I brought Daniel Okafor's son and daughter over to where my father stood, and I said, "This is Senior Chief Vance, and these are Senior Chief Okafor's children." And I watched 2 families who had each lost something to the sea recognize each other without needing the details explained. My father shook the son's hand for a long time. He did not let go quickly. One old chief, honoring another through the children he left behind. There are handshakes that say more than any eulogy, and that was one of them, and I will keep it as long as I keep anything. At the end of the day, my father and I stood together at the rail, looking out at the harbor. He was quiet for a long while. We watched a tug work a barge across the harbor, and a few gulls argued over something, and the new ship sat behind us full of sailors and purpose. My father had his hands on the rail, the same hands that had hauled lines on decks before I was born, and I noticed they were old now, spotted and a little unsteady, and I thought about how many years I had spent waiting and how few we might have left, and I decided I was grateful for every one of them that remained. Then he said the plain, full thing, the thing he could not say at the citation board because it had been too big to lift yet. "I was wrong about what the real Navy was," he said. "All those years, it turns out it was you. It was you the whole time." I did not make a speech. I had learned that some moments only get smaller when you put words on them. I reached over and put my hand on top of his, on the cold rail, and he turned his hand over and held mine, and neither of us said anything more. I just let the peace be enough, and we stood at the rail, a daughter and her father, and for the first time in my life, the ocean in front of us looked the same size to both of us. So let me leave you with this, whoever you are, wherever you are listening from. If there is someone whose eyes you have spent your life trying to catch, I hope with everything in me that they look up while you can still see them do it. I hope you get your Tuesday phone call I hope you get your moment at the rail. But if they never do, then hear me, because I learned this on a wet deck and a dry reception floor and a pier where a boy turned me away. You do not need to be recognized to be real. You were real the whole time. The work was real. The watches you stood, that no one clapped for, were real. The ship sails either way. And so do you. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. I'd really love to hear from you now. If your family decided who you were long before you ever got the chance to show them, how long did it take for the truth to finally land? Have you ever had a moment where the one person you'd waited your whole life to be seen by, finally, actually saw you? And do you think I was right to let that young ensign stand easy instead of reporting him? Tell me in the comments because I read every one of them. And if this story found something in you, hit subscribe and stay a while.